The fog that night didn't just cover the ground. It erased the world. It rolled over England like a living thing, swallowing houses, rivers, forests, entire towns. From above, returning bomber crews couldn't see the coastline, the searchlights, the airfields, nothing. The pilots stared into a solid white void, as if someone had painted over the entire country. The engines hummed with a tired, uneven rhythm. The fuel needles sank slowly, and not a single man on board knew if he'd ever feel solid ground again. They had survived the flak over Germany, the night fighters over the North Sea, the cold that froze breath to oxygen masks. But fog was the enemy no one could fight. Inside one Lancaster, the navigator wiped frost off the window with a trembling glove. He pressed his face close, hoping to catch even a glimpse of a field or road or river. But the fog was absolute. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Visibility 0. Fuel critically low. Attempting approach. Losing height. Some voices cut off mid-sentence. Others didn't return at all. Every man in the bomber knew what that meant. A crash in the fog was silent at first, then a distant thud, then nothing. The pilot glanced at his fuel gauge. 5 minutes left, maybe less. His hands shook on the controls. He had flown missions over Berlin, over Essen, over Hamburg. None of them felt like this. He whispered to himself, not like this, not now. And then something impossible happened. A glow. Faint at first. A soft orange shimmer bleeding through the fog far below. The crew leaned toward the windows. The glow sharpened, brightened, stretched into 2 blazing lines, parallel, long, unmistakably straight. They weren't fires from a crash. They weren't burning buildings. They were too perfect, too deliberate. The pilot blinked twice, thinking he was hallucinating. But he wasn't. He was looking at a runway on fire. The flames didn't flicker randomly like normal burning petrol. They roared in controlled streams, racing down the edges of the landing strip, as if someone had poured molten light into the earth. The heat punched upward, tearing a vertical corridor through the fog, carving open the night sky. The fog didn't fade, it fled, boiling back into steam as the flames pushed it aside. The pilot stared in disbelief. What the hell is that? Control tower came through the radio. That lad is your landing. Get down here. He lowered his Lancaster toward the inferno, hands trembling as the windshield fogged with steam. The heat turbulence rocked the plane violently. The runway glowed like a doorway into another world. Every instinct told him this was madness. No one lands between 2 walls of fire, and yet it was the only thing visible in a country swallowed by darkness. He committed, wheels down, flaps set, flames reflecting across the bomber's metal skin. He touched down on the steaming concrete. Brakes squealed. The bomber rolled through a haze of white vapor and orange light, and when it finally stopped, the crew just sat there, silent, exhausted, shaking. They had survived the impossible. But what they didn't know, what almost no pilot knew in the moment, was that what saved them wasn't luck or fate. It was a secret British invention built out of desperation, fear, and genius. Its name was FIDO. It worked by burning thousands of gallons of petrol a minute, and it saved more than 10,000 lives. The story of how it came to exist doesn't start with fire. It starts with death. Throughout the early years of the war, more British bombers were being lost over friendly territory than over enemy lines. Fog was the silent executioner. Entire squadrons would return from deadly missions, only to circle helplessly above their own runways, unable to see through the white shroud waiting below. They would run out of fuel, stall, spiral downward, and smash into fields or trees or farmhouses. Ground crews knew the sound too well. A dull thump carried through fog, followed by silence. Each noise was another 10 men gone. Commanders were furious. Weather reports grew more frantic. Engineers proposed solutions that all failed. Floodlights made the fog glow brighter, but didn't clear it. New approach paths failed. Radios couldn't guide a plane through something that thick. Britain was fighting the Luftwaffe at night and losing men to weather at dawn. It was a scientist named Sir Henry Tizard, a man famous for pushing radical ideas, who first asked the question that changed everything: can we burn the fog away? People laughed. Burn fog. Fog is water. You don't burn water. But Tizard didn't mean literally burn it. He meant heat it. heated enough to force it upward, thin it out, crack it open. If enough hot air could rise at once, maybe it could punch a hole through fog like a fist through a curtain. Engineers were skeptical. Some called it madness. Some said it was too dangerous. Some said it would take too much fuel. But the RAF didn't need safe ideas. They needed a miracle. The first experiments were crude. Engineers lined up rows of burners along a small airstrip. They pumped petrol through pipes, set it alight, and watched the flames rise. The heat warped the air. Fog shifted slightly, then settled back. Not enough. They doubled the fuel flow. Flames burst higher. Fog thinned for a moment, then closed in. Then one night, in mid-1942, during an especially thick fog, they pushed every pump to maximum. Flames screamed upward, bright enough to turn shadows blue. The heat became unbearable to stand near. And for the first time, the fog didn't just thin, it lifted. A clear gap opened above the runway. Thin, flickering, but real. Someone shouted, "We've got it. We've bloody got it." The system was dangerous. It consumed petrol at a rate that made commanders pale. The flames could scorch a plane if misaligned. Any leak in the pipeline could create an explosion. But none of that mattered. If FIDO worked, it meant thousands of men could come home. Within months, construction began at specially chosen airfields. Long trenches were dug beside runways. Pipes were installed, thick steel, stretching the entire length of the landing strip. Pumps were hidden in blast-proof bunkers. Fuel tanks were buried nearby. The entire system was disguised as ordinary infrastructure, so enemy reconnaissance wouldn't notice. Workers installed igniters along the trenches, simple spark plugs, but designed to withstand unbearable heat. Engineers ran pressure tests. Ground crews trained for emergency activation. Some men burned their hands during drills. Some fainted from heat exhaustion. But they kept going. Because every night, somewhere over the North Sea or the Channel, another bomber was circling low on fuel, praying for a miracle. That miracle was coming. And when FIDO was finally switched on during a real emergency, on a fog-choked night, when dozens of bombers were minutes from death, Britain saw something no one had ever seen before. Runways on fire, and pilots flying home through death and darkness suddenly saw life carved out of the fog by flame. The first night, FIDO came alive for real, changed everything. Ground crews at the airfield had been listening to pilot after pilot report the same hopeless message. "We can't see the runway. We're running out of fuel." Attempting descent, no visual. Voices cracked with fear. Engines sputtered. Even the radio static sounded tense. The fog outside was so thick that men on the ground couldn't see more than 2 or 3 paces ahead. They moved through the whiteness like shadows, banging into equipment, shouting directions, barely able to hear each other over the distant hum of circling bombers. Then the order came through the control tower. "Activate FIDO. Full power." Fuel pumps thundered to life. The trenches began to rumble as petrol surged through them. Technicians sprinted along the runway edges, checking pressure valves with trembling fingers, feeling the pipes vibrate like the heartbeat of some enormous creature waking up. Officers barked instructions no one could see, but everyone could hear. Men could feel heat rising before the flames even appeared. Then the ignition signal was triggered. A spark, a roar, a line of fire erupted so violently it momentarily blinded the crews standing too close. The flame raced down the trench faster than a man could run, a glowing serpent igniting the night. A second line ignited across the runway, 2 blazing borders framing a strip of concrete that had been invisible seconds before. The fog convulsed, twisted, recoiled from the raw heat. Within moments, it rose off the runway like a living blanket being peeled away. Ground crews stared, stunned. Even those who had seen small tests weren't ready for the scale of it. The heat rolled across the tarmac like a physical force. The fog above the runway didn't fade, it exploded upward, punched by rising air, torn apart in a violent spiral. A vertical tunnel appeared, a corridor carved through weather itself. For the first time that night, pilots could see something, anything below them. In one bomber, a young flight engineer shouted, "There! There! Look!" The pilot leaned forward, gripping the controls as the fog tore open beneath his aircraft. He saw flames, 2 burning rails cutting across the landscape. He blinked in disbelief. He'd heard rumors of some kind of fire-based system, but he'd dismissed them as nonsense. No one in their right mind would set an entire airfield on fire, except someone had, and it was working. He radioed the tower. "Confirm, is that the runway? Are those flames?" The reply came instantly. "Affirmative. Bring your bird home." Home. The word felt unreal after hours of flying through darkness toward what felt like certain death. The pilot lowered his Lancaster into the fiery corridor. Heat buffeted the wings. Steam clouded the windows. The smell of burning petrol seeped into the cockpit. For a moment, the entire world looked orange, glowing, shimmering, alive. The landing was rough. The wheels hit the ground hard and skidded across steam-slick concrete, but the bomber remained intact. As the aircraft slowed, the pilot realized his entire crew was silent. Not a word, not a breath. They were still gripping their seats as if waiting to crash. Then someone laughed. A shaky, broken laugh that turned into relief. They had lived. More bombers followed. One came in trailing smoke. Another had lost one engine entirely. A third was so low on fuel the propellers were barely turning. But the fiery corridor held, and each plane found its way down. Some hit the ground awkwardly, bouncing once or twice. But they landed, and the ground erupted with shouts every time another silhouette touched down safely. One of the ground crew later said, "It looked like ghosts appearing out of the fog, and then turning into men we had already thought dead." Word spread fast. By dawn, every man who had witnessed FIDO knew they'd seen something extraordinary. They didn't just see flames. They saw life forced back into planes that had been seconds from disappearing into the fog forever. As the war deepened into 1944, FIDO-equipped airfields became the last hope for countless crews. On nights when fog rolled in thick as wool, entire bomber groups diverted to the flaming fields. Some planes arrived with holes punched through their fuselage. Some were missing entire control surfaces. A few landed with wounded gunners barely alive. One aircraft, a Halifax, landed with only one functional engine. The pilot later said he aimed not for the runway, but for the fire itself, because it was the only thing he could see. FIDO wasn't perfect. It was dangerous to operate. The heat could warp metal. The flames could rise unpredictably. Birds ignited mid-flight. The smoke was choking. The noise was deafening, and the fuel consumption was beyond belief. On some nights, engineers pumped 50,000 gallons of petrol into the trenches just to keep the fog at bay. The fire was so intense that grass near the runways sometimes burst into flames. Local farmers miles away saw the sky glow orange and thought German bombers were attacking again. But none of that mattered, because each gallon of fuel meant another bomber lived to land. Some pilots described the experience as descending through the gates of hell. Others said the fire looked like someone had drawn a path with molten metal. One man wrote in his diary, "I had never been more terrified and never more grateful." Another pilot simply said, "FIDO didn't save our plane. It saved my crew." Fog wasn't the only danger the flames solved. During the winter months, snow and freezing air created deadly icing conditions. Bombers returning from long missions often flew through layers of freezing cloud that coated windows with ice and made instruments sluggish. FIDO's intense heat created a bubble of warm air above the runway that melted ice off the plane's leading edges as it descended, giving pilots just enough control to complete the landing. For many, that small advantage was the difference between touching down safely and sliding into the ground nose first. Inside the control towers, officers watched each landing with clenched fists. The flames cast their silhouettes across the glass as they guided plane after plane down. Controllers rarely blinked. They knew what was at stake. A single misalignment, a gust of wind, a sudden downdraft could send a bomber into the fiery trench or into the fog beyond. But still they brought them in, one voice at a time. "Ease left, hold it, steady, you're clear, drop the gear, you've got it, welcome home." For pilots, the emotional impact of those words was indescribable. They could hear the fire roaring under them through the radio static. They could smell the heat. They could feel the turbulence hit the fuselage, and then contact, wheels down, engines throttled back, steam rising around the cockpit, hearts pounding, silence, survival. But FIDO wasn't just a dramatic invention. It was a psychological weapon against fear. Before FIDO, bomber crews ended missions with dread. Even after escaping German guns, the last 30 minutes of flight were often the most terrifying. They knew that fog might take them. They knew that an airfield buried under cloud might erase their chance of returning home. But once FIDO became operational, the fear changed. They knew that somewhere, even on the worst nights, there could be fire waiting for them. Fire that meant safety, not danger, and that made them braver. Crews pushed deeper into Germany because they trusted they could get back. Commanders approved riskier missions because the chance of losing entire squadrons to fog had dropped. FIDO didn't just save planes. It helped maintain the heart of Bomber Command. The morale boost was real, measurable, and powerful. Still, very few people outside the airfields even knew FIDO existed. It wasn't a secret exactly, but it wasn't advertised. It was too unbelievable, too surreal, too extravagant. Burning rivers of petrol in a time of rationing? No civilian would understand. Most people had no idea why the sky sometimes glowed orange on foggy nights. They thought factories were aflame, or munitions depots had been hit. Only after the war did the truth fully come out. Britain had been setting its own runways on fire to save its men, and the number of men saved wasn't small. It was thousands. When the war finally began to turn in the Allies' favor, some commanders reflected on FIDO with awe. One air marshal wrote that FIDO was as vital to operations as any weapon we deployed. Another said, it turned death into landing light. Pilots who survived their FIDO landings never forgot them. One veteran, decades later, said, I remember every detail of Berlin. I remember every detail of Hamburg, but nothing stays in my memory like the sight of those flames on the runway. That was home. As the European war drew to a close, FIDO still burned at key airfields through the last harsh winter. But peace was coming, and with it the end of the system that had saved so many. Once the need disappeared, the enormous cost, financial, logistical, and manpower was impossible to justify. FIDO was a wartime miracle, not a peacetime luxury. But before it faded, it saved one last bomber, one last crew. And afterward, when the flames finally died and the fog reclaimed the runways, the men who had kept those flames alive stood quietly along the tarmac, staring at the trenches that had glowed brighter than anything else in the war. The heat marks on the concrete, the scorched earth beside the pipes, the faint smell of burnt petrol that lingered even after the fires had cooled. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary, something that would never happen again. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the skies above Britain began to quiet. Engines that had once shaken windows across the countryside now fell silent. The bombers that returned from missions no longer carried the weight of fear in their wings. Hangars filled with aircraft awaiting their last flights home, not to battle, but to storage, museums, or scrap. The men who had survived their tours looked around at the airfields and realized something strange. Without the war, everything felt too calm, too empty, too quiet. And FIDO, the fire that had carved survival through the night, suddenly had nothing left to save. For a while, the installations were kept on standby. No one wanted to shut down something that had become such a symbol of safety. But without bombers crossing the North Sea each night, without fog swallowing returning crews, without the desperate need to rip open the sky, FIDO's purpose evaporated. The fuel tanks were drained. The ignition systems cooled. The pumps fell silent. Men who had spent months tending those flames found themselves staring at the trenches where fire once roared, and feeling an emptiness they couldn't explain. Some said extinguishing FIDO felt like saying goodbye to a friend. The engineers who built the system walked the length of the runway one last time. They touched the warm metal of the pipes, still stained black from years of flame. They remembered the first night it worked, the night they watched fog lift like a curtain and a corridor open through the unbreakable. They remembered the faces of pilots stepping out of their planes, shaken, exhausted, alive. They remembered how many times the fire had delivered men back to their families. And they knew that no photograph, no blueprint, no official report would ever truly capture what FIDO had done. In the months after the war, crews dismantled parts of the system, piece by piece. Some pipes were dug up and removed, others were left buried under fresh pavement. The trenches were filled. Grass grew where flames had once stood taller than a man. Airfields returned to quiet, ordinary life. And soon, the world moved on. New technologies emerged. Radar landing systems, instrument approaches, weather forecasting tools. All elegant, all efficient, all clean. None of them required setting the ground on fire, but none of them carried the same emotional weight. Pilots who flew decades later never knew what it felt like to descend toward two rivers of flame cutting through a wall of fog. They never felt the heat shake the wings or saw the steam rise off the runway in white sheets. They never heard the roar of burning petrol mixing with the roar of engines. They never experienced the moment when death was seconds away, and then suddenly, miraculously, a fiery path home appeared below. FIDO belonged to a different kind of war, a war where men fought not just an enemy, but the sky itself. Many veterans never talked about their FIDO landings, not because they forgot them, but because they couldn't describe them. How do you explain landing through fire that wasn't meant to kill? How do you explain seeing flames and feeling relief instead of fear? How do you explain the emotion of flying over your own country, believing you'd die in fog, and then seeing an entire runway light up like someone setting the night on fire just for you? Some pilots tried. They wrote about it in memoirs decades later. One said, "I remember the glow of the flames more clearly than I remember the faces of the men I flew with." Another wrote, "It wasn't fire, it was hope, hope you could see." A third wrote simply, "FIDO saved me, twice." The RAF estimated that more than 10,000 airmen survived because of FIDO. 10,000 men who would have vanished into fog, forgotten in fields or forests, if not for the flames. 10,000 families who received letters saying their sons or husbands or fathers were coming home after all. And yet, FIDO remained one of the least publicly understood systems of the entire war. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a weapon. It didn't win battles. It didn't destroy factories or shoot down planes. It didn't fit into the popular image of wartime innovation. It was too strange, too extreme, too unbelievable, which is exactly why its story matters. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary things aren't the ones shouted in history books, but the ones done quietly in the dark, behind a wall of fog, for men who may never know the names of the people who saved them. Sometimes, the inventions that matter most aren't the ones used to win wars, but the ones used to bring people home. FIDO was one of those inventions. A system powered not by strategy, but by desperation. Not by aggression, but by compassion. Not by the desire to destroy, but by the determination to protect. It was a reminder that in the middle of a global conflict built on violence, someone looked at fog, a natural phenomenon, and said, "This will not kill our boys, not if we can stop it." And so they built a machine that burned like fury, roared like a monster, and tore open the sky, only so exhausted men could land safely at the end of the longest nights of their lives. Long after the flames went out, FIDO lived on in the memories of the men who saw it. Sometimes in stories told quietly over late-night drinks. Sometimes in old letters tucked away in drawers. Sometimes in the silence that followed when someone asked, "What was the scariest landing you ever made?" And sometimes, decades later, in the words of an old pilot who survived the war, who survived the fog, who survived the impossible because fire showed him the way. He said, "I never thought I'd be glad to see flames, but those flames, they were the most beautiful thing I ever saw." This was FIDO, a runway on fire, a path through death, a miracle made of petrol and courage, and one of the greatest stories of World War II that almost no one knows.